The grand oculus of the High Synod was not designed to show defeat, yet that was all it reflected in the crimson hues of a burning nebula. The glass, kilometers thick and reinforced with transparent aluminum lattices, curved over the vast amphitheater where the voices of 1,000 species usually merged in a symphony of governance. Now, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic thrumming of the station's atmospheric cyclers and the nervous shuffling of carapace against stone. High Justicar Valen, a towering figure whose chitinous plating shimmered with the iridescent polish of high office, stood at the precipice of the speaker's dais, his compound eyes fixed on the holographic projection floating in the center of the chamber. It was a humiliating image. It showed the latest acquisition from the Terran United Systems, a collection of vessels that looked less like instruments of war and more like the discarded refuse of a dead industrial age. They drifted in the vacuum of the anchorage sector, starkly contrasting against the sleek, pearlescent curves of the Synod's own dwindling fleet. The Terran ships were blocky, asymmetrical monstrosities of jagged edges and exposed piping, their hulls coated in a thick, uneven layer of reddish-brown oxidation that flaked into the void like dried blood. To the aesthetic sensibilities of the Synod, where form and function were synthesized into elegant art, these ships were an insult. They were ugly. They were primitive, and most damning of all, they appeared to be rotting before they had even fired a single shot. Valen gripped the edges of the dais, his talons scratching deep grooves into the obsidian surface, the sound echoing sharply through the cavernous hall. The political tension in the room was palpable, a suffocating miasma of fear and indignation that had been building for cycles. The war against the Pale Harrow was going poorly. Entire systems had been silenced, their stars darkened, and their populations converted into biomass for the Harrow's relentless biomechanical swarm. Desperation had driven the Synod to look outside their own enlightened borders, to the fringes of the galactic spiral where the humans dwelt in their smoke-choked nebulas. "We paid in refined iridium," War Marshal Korth growled from the lower tier, his voice a subsonic rumble that vibrated in the chests of every delegate present. Korth was of the Draxian lineage, a species bred for combat, heavyset and encased in natural armor, yet even he looked weary. His usual bravado was dampened by the sight on the screen. "We emptied the treasury of the outer rim sectors. We promised them trade routes. We debased ourselves to beg for aid from a species that still utilizes combustion for surface transport. And this is what they deliver." Korth gestured violently with a massive, three-fingered hand toward the projection of the rusted hulks. "Scrap metal, derelicts salvaged from a gravity well. Look at the hull integrity readings. The oxidation levels are critical. They sold us rusted warships, Valen. They sold us their garbage and called it a fleet. It is not just theft, it is a mockery of our plight." The murmurs of agreement rippled through the amphitheater, a tide of angry whispers in 100 different languages, translated instantly by the neural laces worn by every diplomat. The mood was shifting from despair to fury. It was easier to be angry at the humans for a bad deal than to face the existential terror of the Pale Harrow, whose fleets were currently dismantling the defensive perimeter of the Antares sector. The Synod needed a scapegoat, and the humans, with their silence and their ugly ships, were the perfect candidates. Valen raised a hand for silence, the motion fluid and practiced, though his internal emotional state was a tempest of anxiety. He had authorized the purchase. He had bypassed the trade regulations. If this was indeed a scam, his head would be the first to roll, figuratively and perhaps literally depending on which faction seized power in the aftermath. "The Terran delegation has arrived at the docking spire," Valen announced, his voice amplified to fill the vastness of the chamber. "They are currently undergoing decontamination protocols. We will hear their explanation before we condemn them. Perhaps there is a misunderstanding of our scanning technology. Perhaps the oxidation is a camouflage." It was a weak hope, and Valen knew it. The laughter that bubbled up from the Cynosian representatives, beings of pure energy contained within glass suits, was stinging. "Camouflage," the Cynosian lead diplomat sneered, the light within his suit pulsing with sarcastic yellow hues. "Rust is not camouflage, Justicar. Rust is entropy. It is the sign of neglect. These humans are scavengers. We were fools to think that a species that has barely mastered faster-than-light travel could offer anything of value to the Synod. We should eject their vessels into the nearest star and fortify the capital with what remains of our own armada. Let us die with dignity, rather than relying on the refuse of primates." The sentiment was gaining traction. The fear of the Pale Harrow was momentarily eclipsed by the pride of the elder races. They were the architects of the hyperlanes. They were the masters of zero-point energy. To be swindled by the upstarts from Saul was an indignity too great to bear. The doors to the Grand Conclave, massive slabs of neutronium-infused alloy, began to groan open. The sound was deep and resonant, signaling the arrival of the outsiders. The chamber fell silent, thousands of eyes turning toward the entrance, expecting to see a retinue of guards, a display of pomp and circumstance, or perhaps the ragged appearance of scavengers befitting the ships they had delivered. Instead, a single figure walked through the widening gap. The human was not imposing in stature compared to the towering Draxian or the elongated limbs of the ethereal Ethelgard. He was of average height, dressed in a uniform of charcoal gray that absorbed the ambient light rather than reflecting it. There were no medals on his chest, no gold braiding, no energy shields shimmering around his form. He walked with a steady, rhythmic gait, the sound of his boots on the polished floor the only noise in the immense hall. He carried a simple metallic briefcase in one hand, and his face was a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. This was Ambassador Kale. He did not look around with wonder at the architectural marvels of the Synod. He did not flinch under the weight of the hostile stares. He simply walked to the center of the floor, beneath the projection of the rusted ships, and stopped. He looked up at Valen, his eyes dark and unreadable, devoid of the fear or deference that usually characterized the demeanor of younger species standing before the High Synod. He waited. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, almost weaponized. Valen felt a bead of condensation trickle down his neck beneath his collar. The human's stillness was unnatural. It was not the stillness of a statue, but the stillness of a predator waiting in tall grass or the stillness of a mountain before an avalanche. "Ambassador Kale," Valen finally spoke, his voice booming but lacking the authority he wished to project. "You stand before the High Synod of the Galactic Concordance. You have fulfilled the contract, in a manner of speaking, but the Council is displeased." Valen gestured to the hologram. "We requested heavy cruisers. We requested vessels capable of withstanding the antimatter lances of the Pale Harrow. We requested the pinnacle of your engineering. Instead, you have delivered these relics. Our sensors indicate significant structural degradation. The hulls are oxidized. The energy signatures are virtually non-existent. Explain this insult before we declare the contract void and seize your transport as reparation." The threat hung in the air, heavy and sharp. War Marshal Korth leaned forward, his mandibles clicking in anticipation of violence. The alien assembly waited for the human to stammer, to apologize, to explain that there had been a mistake in the shipping manifest. Kale did not blink. He slowly set the briefcase down on the floor, the metallic click echoing loudly. He looked at the hologram of the rusted ships, then turned his gaze to Korth, then back to Valen. When he spoke, his voice was unamplified, yet it carried a peculiar resonance, a baritone quality that seemed to cut through the atmospheric hum of the station. "You asked for weapons that could kill the Harrow," Kale said. "We delivered them. The aesthetics were not part of the negotiation." His tone was flat, factual, bordering on bored. "The oxidation you see is not a defect. It is the primary weapon system." A ripple of incredulous laughter broke out among the delegates. "Rust is a weapon." Korth barked, slamming his fist down. "Do you take us for hatchlings? Do you think we do not know the chemical process of ferrous degradation? Iron oxide is brittle, it flakes, it offers no resistance to thermal lances. You have sold us rotting coffins." Kale turned his entire body to face the War Marshal. The movement was slow, deliberate. "You fight with shields," Kale stated, not as a question, but as an observation of fact. "Your entire doctrine of warfare is based on energy projection and energy mitigation. You wrap your ships in bubbles of coherence. You fire beams of coherent light. You are elegant. You are advanced." He paused, and for a moment a flicker of something like pity crossed his features. "And you are losing. You are losing because the Pale Harrow feeds on coherence. They eat your shields. They drink your lasers. Every shot you fire makes them stronger. Every shield you raise is a dinner bell." The room went quiet again. The human had touched upon the open wound of the war. It was true. The Harrow ship seemed to absorb the Synod's energy weapons, glowing brighter with every volley before unleashing devastating counterattacks. The Synod's scientists had been baffled, trying to modulate frequencies, trying to find a gap in the absorption spectrum. "So we did not bring you energy," Kale continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming graver. "We brought you mass. We brought you entropy. The hulls of those ships are not coated in simple rust. It is a hyperoxidized entropic alloy cultivated in the high-gravity foundries of the Uit cloud. It is dead matter. It is chemically inert, structurally dense, and spiritual void. The Harrow cannot eat it because there is no energy to consume. It is poison to them. It is the taste of the grave." He gestured to the ugly, blocky ships. Those ships are not designed to repel fire with force fields. They are designed to take the hit, to absorb the kinetic impact and redistribute it through the lattice of the rust. The more they are struck, the denser the alloy becomes. We do not deflect, we endure. Valen stared at the human, his mind racing to comprehend the strategy. It was a doctrine of warfare so primitive it had been forgotten by the elder races eons ago. To simply take the hit, to build armor so thick, so heavy that it rendered shields obsolete. It was barbaric, it was suicidal. And the offensive capabilities? Valen asked, his voice trembling slightly. If they have no energy weapons, how do they destroy the enemy? Kale smiled then, a cold, thin expression that did not reach his eyes. We don't burn them, High Justicar, we break them. Those ships are equipped with magnetic acceleration cannons running the length of the spine. We fire solid slugs of depleted uranium and ferric tungsten. No energy signature, just mass and velocity. When a solid object moving at a fraction of light speed hits a Harrow vessel, it doesn't matter how much energy they can absorb. Kinetic energy cannot be eaten. It must be transferred. They will shatter like glass. The chamber was silent for a long time. The concept was alien to them. They had spent thousands of years refining the art of war into a dance of light and mathematics. The humans had brought them a hammer, a heavy, rusty, brutal hammer. This is theoretical, Korth grumbled, though his aggression had been replaced by a skeptical curiosity. We have no proof. The enemy fleet will be within the system perimeter in less than a standard rotation. If you are wrong, human, we all die, and your species will be hunted down for this treachery. We are not wrong, Kale said softly. And we are not just selling you ships. We are the crew. We do not trust you to pilot the Iron Armada. You would try to turn on the shields and give away the position. You would try to flee. These ships do not flee. He tapped a command into his wrist unit. On the giant screen, the rusted hulks began to move. They didn't glide with the grace of the Synod ships. They lurched, their engines burning with a dirty chemical fire that spewed particulate matter into the void. They formed a wall, a jagged barrier between the Synod's delicate space station and the dark vector where the Harrow would emerge. The purchase is complete, Kale said. Now observe. The hours that followed were an exercise in agonizing tension. The Synod remained in session, the delegates unable to look away from the screens. The grand strategic map showed the red tide of the pale Harrow entering the system. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, crystalline shards of oscillating light, moving in perfect unison, a hive mind of destruction. They outnumbered the rusted human ships 10-1. The Synod's own remaining fleet pulled back, forming a desperate perimeter around the station, leaving the human vessels exposed in the vanguard. The contrast was painful to watch. The ethereal, singing crystals of the Harrow against the silent, brown lumps of the Terran ships. They are hailing the human vessels, a sensor officer announced from the pit below the dais. The Harrow is broadcasting the submission frequency. This was the psychological weapon of the enemy, a psychic scream that usually incapacitated crews before the firing began. The human response? Valen asked. There is no response, High Justicar. The human ships are broadcasting static, just white noise, analog static. The first volley came from the Harrow. Beams of coherent antimatter lashed out across the void, lances of pure destruction that had cleaved through the Synod's capital ships like paper. The beams struck the lead human vessel, the *Un's rust bucket, a name the translator struggled to parse with dignity. The Synod flinched, expecting the ship to vaporize. Instead, the beams hit the oxidized hull and dissipated. The rust glowed a bright, angry orange where the beams connected, the heat spreading across the surface, but the hull did not buckle. The chemical reaction described by Kale was visible. The rust seemed to darken. Hardening instantly under the thermal load, the ship absorbed the energy of a star and simply kept moving forward. Impact confirmed, the sensor officer shouted, his voice cracking with disbelief. Hull integrity holding at 98%, the armor. It's feeding on the thermal energy to catalyze the bonding process. They are getting stronger. Then the human ships returned fire. There were no flashes of laser fire, no plasma arcs. Just the silent, invisible ripple of magnetic rails discharging. Across the void, invisible projectiles crossed the distance in microseconds. The Harrow ships, accustomed to absorbing energy, had no kinetic barriers. They relied on their ability to eat the attack. But you cannot eat a 20-ton tungsten rod moving at 0.05 light speed. The result was catastrophic for the invaders. The lead Harrow vessel didn't explode, it shattered. One moment it was a singing crystal construct, the next it was a cloud of glittering dust and twisted debris. The kinetic impact transferred so much energy that the internal structure of the alien ship liquefied instantly. A cheer, ragged and shocked, went up from the Synod. Korth stood up, his mouth agape. By the ancestors, he whispered. They just broke it. The battle that ensued was not a dogfight, it was a massacre. The human ships, the rusted warships, advanced relentlessly. They did not dodge. They took every hit the Harrow threw at them, their hulls glowing cherry red, then cooling to a dull, invincible black. They rammed the smaller enemy fighters, crushing them against their armored prows. They fired their railguns with mechanical precision, turning the beautiful crystalline fleet into a graveyard of dust. It was brutal, ugly, industrial warfare. It was the factory floor brought to the battlefield. It was humanity's answer to the elegant equations of the galaxy, a brick to the face. Within 2 hours, the Harrow fleet was in retreat, something that had never happened in the history of the war. They could not fight something they could not consume. They fled into the dark, leaving behind the wreckage of their vanguard. The human ships did not pursue. They simply held their line, cooling in the void, shedding flakes of super-hardened rust that drifted like confetti in the starlight. Back in the chamber, the silence was different now. It was the silence of awe and of fear. The humans had not just won a skirmish. They had invalidated the military doctrine of the last 10,000 years. Valen looked down at Ambassador Kale, who had not moved, not cheered, not shown a single emotion during the entire engagement. He stood there, a small figure in a gray uniform, casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire galaxy. "The contract is fulfilled," Kale said, breaking the silence. "The immediate threat is neutralized. We will leave a garrison of the Iron Armada to oversee the fortification of your perimeter." "Ambassador," Valen stammered, we misjudged. The Synod owes you a debt that cannot be paid in iridium. We must discuss an alliance, a permanent seat for Terra on the Council. We must share this technology. We must." Kale raised a hand, stopping the High Justicar mid-sentence. "No," the human said. "You misunderstand. We did not sell you these ships because we needed the money, and we did not save you because we desire a seat at your table." He picked up his briefcase. "We saved you because the Harrow is a nuisance, but they are running from something, and that something is why we are here." A chill went through the room, colder than the void outside. "Running?" Korth asked, stepping down from his podium to stand on the floor level, dwarfing the human but feeling infinitely smaller. "The Harrow are the apex predators. What could they possibly be running from?" Kale looked at the alien warlord, and for the first time his eyes showed a depth of age and weariness that terrified the gathered species. "They are running from the entropy that we mastered," Kale said cryptically. "But that is a discussion for another time. There is a second part to the contract, High Justicar, one we did not write down but one you will agree to now." "Name it," Valen said immediately. "Anything." "The ships," Kale said, gesturing to the screen where the victorious, ugly vessels drifted. "They are not just warships, they are anchors. You will maintain them, you will let them rust. You will not try to repair them, paint them, or upgrade them with your fragile energy tech. You will let them sit in your orbit ugly and decaying, because the rust is a signal." "A signal to whom?" Valen asked, his voice barely a whisper. "To the others," Kale said. "The ones the Harrow are fleeing. The ones who watch the spaces between galaxies. When they see the rust, they will know that we Asterisk are here. They will know that this sector is under the protection of the Iron lineage, and they will pass you by." "Who are the others?" Korth demanded, his warrior instinct. TS screaming that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. "And who are you really? You are not just industrialists from a backwater system. No young species builds ships that embrace entropy." Kale smiled again, and this time it was a smile of terrible sadness. "You look at the rust and you see decay," he said softly. "We look at the rust and we see time. You are right, War Marshal. We are not young. We are the survivors of the previous cycle. We are the ones who were left behind when the universe crunched and expanded again. We have lived in the dark for a long time. We learned that to survive the end of all things, you must become hard, you must become cold, you must become the rust." He turned to leave, his boots clicking on the floor. "The Harrow kneels before us because they recognize the scent of the old dead universe on our ships. They know they cannot kill what is already dead, keep the ships High Justicar, keep them rusted. As long as the iron bleeds, you will be safe." Kale walked out of the chamber, leaving the High Synod in a stunned paralysis. The screen above them showed the UNS Rust Bucket, its hull scarred and ugly, floating against the backdrop of the stars. It no longer looked like garbage. It looked like a tombstone, a monument to a stubbornness so profound it had outlasted the death of a universe. The aliens looked at each other, their sleek armors and energy shields suddenly seeming fragile and childish. They had bought rusted warships, and in doing so they had bought the protection of the ghosts of reality. The political fallout was immediate, but quiet. There were no celebrations, no parades. The realization of what humanity represented sat heavy in the stomachs of the elder races. They had spent millennia believing they were the pinnacle of evolution, the guardians of the galaxy. Now they knew they were merely children playing in a sandbox, watched over by a tired, rusted gardener who had seen the garden die 1,000 times before. Deep in the war room, hours later, Korth sat alone, reviewing the telemetry of the battle. He zoomed in on the hull of the lead human ship. At maximum magnification, amidst the jagged layers of oxidized metal, he saw something etched into the steel, barely visible under the layers of corrosion. It was not a name or a number. It was a phrase, written in an ancient, angular script that the translator struggled to parse before finally rendering it into the common tongue. Iron within, iron without. Korth turned off the screen and sat in the darkness. He understood now. The humans were not fighting for territory or resources or glory. They were fighting simply because they were the anvil upon which the universe broke its hammers, and the Synod, in their arrogance, had hired the anvil to fight a glass cutter. The weeks turned into months. The Iron Armada remained in orbit, a silent, ugly sentinel. The Ethelgard engineers, once so eager to strip the ships down and study them, now refused to go near them. They reported a feeling of immense dread when approaching the hulls, a psychic pressure that whispered of infinite age and cold darkness. The rust was not just a chemical compound, it was a psychic residue. It was the accumulated memory of a species that had refused to die. Diplomacy changed. The Terran United Systems did not attend the subsequent council meetings. They didn't need to. Whenever a dispute arose, whenever a border skirmish threatened to escalate into war, a single human vessel would warp into the sector. It wouldn't fire. It wouldn't hail them. It would just sit there, rusting, watching. And the combatants would cease fire, overcome by an irrational fear that if they scratched the paint of the universe, something terrible would bleed out. Valen found himself spending more time in the observation dome, staring at the human flagship. He began to understand the philosophy Kale had spoken of. The old way. The rejection of elegance in favor of endurance. He looked at his own reflection in the glass, smooth, polished, perfect, and he felt weak. He ordered his personal guard to strip the polish from their armor to let the metal darken and scar. It was a small gesture, a cargo cult imitation of the gods they had discovered, but it spread. The cult of the rust began to permeate the lower decks of the station. Soldiers scarred their armor. Engineers left conduits exposed. It became a symbol of toughness, a nod to the silent protectors. But the true test of Kale's warning came a standard year later. The deep-range sensors picked up a signal from the galactic void, far beyond the range of the Harrow's previous incursions. It was a signal of such intensity that it burned out the receiver arrays of 3 listening posts. It was not a transmission of words, but a wave of pure gravitational pressure. Something massive was moving through the dark, something that pushed galaxies aside as it walked. The Synod panicked. The Harrow had been. A swarm of locusts, this new threat felt like the boot coming down to crush them. The others had arrived. Valen stood in the command center, the red lights of alert bathing his face. "Get me the human ambassador," he screamed. "Get me Kale, they said the ships would protect us. They said the signal would work." "We are hailing Terra," the comms officer shouted back. "No response, the channels are dead. The anomaly is entering the system edge," the sensor chief reported, his voice hollow. It's not a ship, High Justicar. It's a tear in space-time. It's an eye, a giant eye. On the main screen, reality distorted. The stars bent and twisted around a central point of absolute darkness. From that darkness, a presence emerged. It was not made of metal or flesh. It was a construct of pure mathematical negation. It was the void manifest. It swept over the outer planets, unraveling them, turning matter into equation and equation into zero. It was the ultimate cleaner, the end of the simulation. "We are lost," Korth whispered. "The rust didn't work." The entity paused. It had reached the perimeter of the capital sector. It loomed over the station, a god of negation ready to wipe the slate clean. Then it stopped. Drifting between the station and the entity was the UNS Rust Bucket. It looked insignificantly small against the backdrop of the cosmic horror. But as the entity focused its attention on the human ship, something happened. The rust on the hull began to glow, not the orange of thermal absorption, but a deep, pulsating violet. The ship began to broadcast. It wasn't a radio signal. It was a song, a low, grinding, mechanical hum that vibrated the very fabric of space. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting, of stars dying, of iron cooling. The entity recoiled. The tear in space-time shuddered. Inside the Synod chamber, the translation matrix went haywire, trying to interpret the interaction. It wasn't language, it was recognition. The entity was scanning the ship, tasting the entropy within the rust. It tasted the flavor of the dead universe. It tasted the presence of the survivors. They are still here. The thought was projected into the minds of every living being in the system. It was not a thought of fear, but of annoyance and perhaps a grudging respect. The Iron Keepers, the refuse, the ONES who do not break. The entity shifted its focus from the station to the rusted ships. For a moment, the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The entity reached out with a tendril of non-existence, brushing against the hull of the asterisk rust bucket. The ship did not unravel. It did not vanish. The rust simply absorbed the touch, the violet light intensifying. The ship was an immovable object standing before an unstoppable force, and the immovable object was winning simply by refusing to acknowledge the force's authority. We will not harvest here, the entity decided. The soil is too hard. The metal is too old. We leave. The tier in spacetime sealed shut with a thunderclap that shook the station to its core. The entity vanished, moving on to softer, younger realities where the prey did not taste of ancient iron. The silence that followed was absolute. The synod delegates were on their knees, not in submission, but in sheer physical exhaustion from the psychic pressure. Valen pulled himself up to the railing, gasping for air. He looked out at the human ship. The violet glow faded, returning to the dull, ugly brown of oxidized metal. It drifted listlessly, looking for all the world like a piece of junk. But Valen saw it clearly now. He saw the beauty in the scar tissue. He saw the strength in the ugly. A communication channel clicked open. It was not Kale. It was an automated message, recorded loops ago, triggered by the departure of the entity. The voice was gravelly, old, and filled with the static of 1,000 years. This is the automated defense buoy rust bucket. Threat containment cycle complete. The contract is upheld. We sold you the ships. We gave you the wall. Now build something worth protecting behind it. Terra out. The channel closed. Valen looked at Korth. The war marshal was weeping, tears sliding down his chitinous face. They knew, Korth said. They knew that thing was coming. That's why they sold us the ships. They weren't arming us for the Harrow. They were tagging us. They marked us as do not eat. They saved us, Valen whispered, by turning us into a junkyard. No, Korth corrected him, standing up and saluting the ugly, rusted rectangle in the sky. By turning us into a fortress. The galaxy changed after that. The Ethelgard aesthetic of smooth curves and energy shields was slowly abandoned. Ships were built thicker, heavier. Armor plating was left unpolished. The rust became a symbol of status. To have a ship that showed the wear of the void was to show that you were a survivor. The political landscape shifted from one of expansion and elegance to one of fortification and endurance. The Synod renamed itself the Iron Concordance. And every year on the anniversary of the purchase, the leaders of the galaxy would gather not in a grand hall, but in the observation deck, looking out at the silent, drifting sentinels. They would kneel, not to a king or a god, but to the memory of the transaction. They knelt before the rust. They knelt before the ugly truth that in a universe of horrors, the only thing that saves you is the willingness to be hard, to be scarred, and to endure. Humanity never took the seat on the council. They never came back to rule. They remained in their smoke-choked nebulas in the fringes, working their forges, preparing for the next threat, the next cycle, the next end of the world. They were the janitors of the cosmos, the ones who dealt with the mess that the elegant races couldn't handle. Valen, now old and his carapace graying with age, wrote his final memoir. He titled it The Aesthetics of Survival Asterisk. In the final chapter, he wrote, "We looked for gods in the light and found only monsters. We looked for salvation in the beautiful and found only fragility. Then we bought rusted warships from the primates and found that the only gods worth worshipping are the ones who are too stubborn to die. They sold us their refuse and we bought our future. Now we kneel before the others, not the aliens, not the entities, but the silent iron giants who taught us that rust is not the end of the metal. Rust is the armor of the soul." The UNS Rust Bucket drifted on, a silent guardian in the dark, its job done, its hull waiting for the next hit, indifferent to the worship of the creatures it protected. It was just a ship. It was just rust, and it was the strongest thing in the universe. The High Synod chamber was eventually decommissioned, replaced by a bunker deep within the planetary crust of the capital world. The crystalline spires were dismantled, the materials repurposed to reinforce the planetary shielding. The lesson had been learned. The universe was not a place for glass houses. It was a place for bunkers. Years later, a young diplomat from a newly discovered species, a race of avian creatures who worshipped the solar winds, arrived at the Iron Concordance. He was led into the presence of High Justicar Korth, now ancient and scarred, sitting on a throne of unpolished granite. "Great Korth," the avian chirped, fluffing his colorful feathers. "We bring gifts of light weave and sonic gems. We seek to join your alliance, but we must ask, why are your ships so ugly? Why do you allow them to rust? Surely with your technology you could make them shine." Korth laughed, a dry, rattling sound like stones grinding together. He stood up, his heavy armor creaking. He walked to the viewport, which no longer looked out at the stars, but at a holographic representation of the asterisk rust bucket, forever enshrined in the center of the room. "You think they are ugly," Korth rumbled, placing a hand on the avian's delicate shoulder. "You see the corrosion and you see neglect. You are young, you still believe that beauty is symmetry, that power is light. He pointed a claw at the image of the rusted ship. That rust is the blood of the universe, little bird. It is the callus on the hand of God. We do not clean it because it is holy. We do not polish it because to polish it would be to erase the history of our survival. Korth looked down at the avian, his eyes burning with the intensity of a convert. One day, if you are lucky, you will be ugly too. You will be scarred. You will be rusted. And on that day, you will know that you are safe. Until then, you will kneel behind the rust, and you will thank the humans that they sold us their trash. The avian looked at the ship, confused, fearful, but sensing the immense weight of the history behind the words. He bowed his head. We will learn to love the rust, High Justicar. Good, Korth said, turning back to his work. Now go and tell your people to start building with iron. The night is long and the glass breaks easily. The legacy of the rust bucket endured. It became a legend, then a myth, then a religion. But far away in the deep dark of the Sol system, the forges kept burning. The humans kept working. They didn't care about the religion. They didn't care about the adoration. They just knew that eventually the entropy would come back. Eventually the others would return or something worse would rise from the deep. And when it did, they would have more ships ready, more rust, more iron, because that was the deal. That was the burden of being the survivors. You don't get to be beautiful. You just get to be the wall, and the wall stands. Forever. Iron within. Iron without. The phrase became the mantra of the galaxy, whispered in the dark, shouted in the heat of battle. It was the gift of Terra. Not weapons, not science, not culture, but the will to endure, the will to rust and remain, and in the silence of the void, the rusted warships drifted on, the silent kings of a terrified, grateful galaxy, forever kneeling before the others, but only so they could brace themselves for the impact. For they knew, as only the humans knew, that the impact always comes. And when it does, it is better to be a rusted shield than a shining sword. The end of the age of glass was the beginning of the age of iron, and it began with a sale, a transaction, a scam, or so they thought. They sold us rusted warships. And now we kneel before the others, but we are alive, we are alive.